Hey, how you doing? This is Chris Franklin with the Endocrine Minute. Today I'm going to be talking to you about cortisol. Feeling stressed, feeling overtaxed, got the election all stressed out. Well, your body has a way of managing all of your stress, and it uses your endocrine system to do it. And we're going to talk about the legendary, problematic, up and down, mysterious cortisol. That's right. We always hear about cortisol, cortisol makes me fat, it makes this, and all of these other maladies that we tend to attract to it. However, let's take a look at what cortisol actually does, and then why you need to have a better form of measurement so that you can trust the numbers you're getting and be able to make those changes. So what does cortisol do? Well, really, cortisol's impact is helping you to mitigate stress. That stress could be coming from pain. Let's say someone that's in chronic pain. One of the ways that your body helps you adapt to the pain is by raising your cortisol levels. And by doing that, it helps blunt off some of the pain. The problem, and this is for people that suffer with chronic pain, is that over time, the adrenal glands become depleted and eventually the cortisol levels can't maintain a high level and the perception of pain grows even though the injury may not have changed. Another one is that cortisol can actually adversely affect blood pressure. That's right. It can be a cause of hypertension due to the stress. It can also cause stomach issues, bloating within the gut, because when cortisol's high, your body is trying to figure out what to do. It's assuming that it's under attack, and so it deprioritizes the gut and to deal with things because it's basically trying to increase blood sugar. And that's one of the other concepts of cortisol, is it stimulates something called gluconeogenesis. And that is a way of raising the blood sugar without using sugars. And it can do that by breaking down amino acids or breaking down proteins for amino acids to increase the blood glucose level. So when you hear about the idea that cortisol can break down muscle or causes you to become catabolic, that's absolutely true. High cortisol levels are going to lead the body to break down proteins for their amino acids so that they can be converted into sugars to raise blood sugar. What's the problem with raising blood sugar is that then we begin to raise insulin levels, and eventually over time we become insulin resistant. That's also why you find people that have elevated or chronically high cortisol levels tends to hold more abdominal fat. That's because one of the reasons is your body is has a scarcity mindset and begins to store everything as excess, so that that sugar that's being stimulated by the cortisol isn't burned off immediately. The next stage is your body begins to raise insulin and then traffics that sugar, that newly made sugar, into the adipose tissue so that it can be stored as fat. Finally, cortisols have a unique effort in being able to calm the brain. Unfortunately, they also lead to brain fog. In one clinical study, when they measured the DHEA, and this is the unconjugated DHEA versus cortisol, they actually found that ratio, as it decreased, meaning that cortisol was disproportionately high, reaction times began to become delayed. So that if you're suffering from some brain fog, one of the causes can be elevated cortisol levels, because while it may be good at blunting pain, it also blunts the brain. So if your cortisol levels are out of whack, then you can't think back. Now, how is cortisol traditionally measured? Cortisol has been measured in clinical labs for decades. This is not a new biomarker. This is not something new. Unfortunately, when you use 40-year-old technology, you end up with 40-year-old results. So the traditional technology, and this is still being used in the vast majority of labs, and this includes LabCorp, Quest, CPL, any of your minor labs, they're typically using an immunoassay. Basically, there are two types of immunoassays. There's what's known as a competitive immunoassay and a sandwich immunoassay. Basically, that's how it goes about achieving its target. The problem is that immunoassays do not directly measure cortisol. So this is kind of confusing, but what immunoassays actually measure is an antibody's response to cortisol. And then depending on how it's conjugated, either through a competitive assay where it's competing or a sandwich assay where it is connected through a biotin streptavidin complex, either one of those are actually targeting the antibody response. So none of those are directly measuring cortisol in the body. Now, the problem with that is that when you indirectly measure something, you begin to lose specificity. That means how well you can distinguish one analyte, or the chosen analyte, cortisol, from, let's say, prednisone or dexamethasone or cortisone, which is also in the body, or hydrocortisone cream. The reality is that due to the lack of specificity, the traditional immunoassay, which is run by 90% of all labs in the US, cannot distinguish between something as simple as prednisone, which you might be taking if you had an infection or you needed a corticosteroid, and the actual endogenous marker cortisol. In fact, if you were to take prednisone, your cortisol on an immunoassay would look high, when in reality, any corticosteroid will create a suppression effect, meaning that your body recognizes that there's this abundance of exogenous corticosteroids available, so therefore it doesn't need to produce any of its own cortisol. There's an actual study that's being run in hospitals oftentimes that's known as a dexamethasone suppression effect. The idea is that they inject dexamethasone into a patient and then wait 24 hours and monitor the response. Does their cortisol levels come back? If not, that signals that there's something wrong with the pituitary gland, or the HPA axis. So now that we've determined that it lacks specificity, one of the other problems, and this was such a problem that the FDA had to put out a warning on all immunoassays, especially those that were measuring hormones. The FDA put a warning about biotin. Now you say, well, biotin doesn't look anything like cortisol, and you would be correct. However, biotin is a B vitamin. It is vitamin B7. It's in almost every product for people that want to try to improve their hair growth or improve their nails. Biotin is there. However, because most of those competitive or sandwich type immunoassays use something called a biotin streptavidin complex to conjugate the antibodies together, if you're actually taking biotin, what happens is the antibody that is attached to the substrate, which actually gives off the fluorescence, is got a streptavidin on one of its recognition complexes. That means that instead of binding to the actual antibodies that has the biotin complex on the back end of it, it's actually binding to circulating biotin, driving the results wrong. Because of this, it created a large number of patients that were misdiagnosed with hypothyroidism when in fact they weren't. Because of the different types of assay, TSH was actually suppressed through biotin, whereas free T4 was increased by biotin. Therefore, it gave a false signal on or dog diagnosis, and that's what led the FDA to put out a warning. However, they included cortisol, DHEA sulfate, testosterone, estradiol. So know this, if you're using immunoassay for any hormone results, the chances are you're wrong. So when I think about doing hormones, it's not an immunoassay, it's an immunoassay. And that's a big difference. So whenever it comes to doing hormones, it's always immunoassay. Look, immunoassays were great technology in the 70s, but this is 2024. It's time for us to move forward in technology. How are we ever going to move health forward when we can't even measure something? There's a very simple principle that I like to go by, that you can't manage what you can't measure. And if you're not measuring cortisol correctly, then how are you going to manage your levels? When you can't even tell whether prednisone has moved your cortisol, how do you know whether your diet has? Now, since we've established that that's not the way to do it, how do you measure cortisols? The gold standard, and this isn't my opinion or any given lab's opinion, this is through hundreds, maybe even thousands of peer-reviewed articles that have shown that tandem mass spectrometry is the gold standard of hormone quantification. There is no better way. It's the most it has the highest degree of specificity, the highest degree of sensitivity available, and the largest quantitative range. So what happens is that allows you to measure the hormone over a greater linear range. It has a greater sensitivity, so you're able to detect even lower levels, or at the lower levels, because when you think about it, disease states don't happen in the optimal range. It doesn't happen in where the 80% of the population exists. The disease state typically happens at either the 10% low or the 10% high state. That's why mass spectrometry gives you the best answer. And one of the unique things about being able to do that is you're not only able to measure cortisol, but you're able to profile all of your corticosteroids. So that would be cortisol, cortisone, corticosterone, each of them with a very unique role in the body, each of them are providing a unique signal and diagnostic information so that you can adjust to making the proper decision. So when you think about it, why measure cortisol? Or why measure cortisone? Even more importantly, cortisone. Most people didn't even recognize that that was endogenous. Well, the bigger question is, how does your body, at the moment stress begins, how can it quickly and easily synthesize cortisol when you're looking at many enzymatic steps from cholesterol? So cholesterol being the first starting point of hormones, it's eventually cleaved off the fatty acid chain and becomes pregnenolone, then progesterone, and it works through multiple pathways to eventually get to cortisol. How does your body actually be able to rapidly produce cortisol at the moment stress or an emergency situation happens? How can it adjust it? Because your cortisol level is given to diurnal variation, meaning that it's going to be the highest in the morning and the lowest in the evening under normal circumstances. So something that's in that kind of flux and then can change that rapidly with whether even you've had food or not. How does your body rapidly do it? Well, it's really no trouble. It's called the cortisone shuffle. That's right. Your body it converts it to cortisol first as the first step, and then your body uses an enzyme and converts it to cortisone. Imagine that as an inactive version of cortisol. It is cortisol in reserve, if you will. It's almost like you bought an extra 5-gallon gas can and you're going to put that in there. So what you want is cortisone and cortisol. Now what happens if you get a cortisol to cortisone ratio? That's going to give you a better idea of how much adrenal reserves you have. Also, is there an enzymatic step that's missing? Maybe your body is converting it in there and having trouble converting back. One of the other unique parts of this is many of the bodybuilding supplements out there claim that they can lower cortisol. And they claim that they're blocking this enzymatic step. This would be the first way to be able to prove those supplements right or wrong. There's a supplement called 11-oxo. There's a couple of recommendations that using licorice and a couple of other supplements will help reduce cortisol, and it's all thought to do that through an enzymatic pathway. This would be the opportunity to be able to test that. I think clinically, one of the unique places, because pain is so intimately associated with cortisol, was you would then be able to use the cortisol to get an idea about a patient's pain. In other words, if someone's got chronic pain, what they found, and this is from literature, is that cortisol tends to end up in what's called a biphasic distribution instead of a Gaussian distribution. A Gaussian distribution has a nice even curve, whereas biphasic means that you, instead of being centered on the middle and then your outer ranges at the top 10 or bottom 10, now what happens is the largest populations occur in the outer ranges and there's very few in the normal. And what they found is in phase 1 of pain is your cortisol is extremely high because your brain and your body is trying to cope with this external stimuli or this injury. Over time, what happens is your body cannot maintain the production of that level of cortisol over time. So then cortisone becomes depleted, and then eventually cortisol follows it. And so what you find is patients with chronic pain, typically if they're in the early stages of chronic pain, tend to have really high cortisol and cortisone levels. Eventually the cortisone level is depleted, eventually leading to a drop in the cortisol levels. This is one of the reasons that once that happens, even though the injury may not have progressed or gotten worse, the perception of the pain did. This is one of the reasons why if you've ever had some type of nagging injury, I went through with my rotator cuffs, I had both of them torn for multiple years. Even though the injury didn't get worse, over time, the perception of the pain got worse because my body's ability to defend against that pain became more diminished with time. So using them in pain management, using them in clinical to functional medicine, being able to get that cortisol-cortisone ratio is going to give you the ability to distinguish whether someone has plenty in adrenal reserves or are they at the early stages of adrenal fatigue. Again, this is not even possible with your traditional immunoassay that doesn't even know if it saw prednisone, cortisol, corticosteroid. They all look the same to immunoassay. The best way to describe immunoassay for measuring hormones is like going in a bar, drinking, and going home with a 10 and waking up with a 2. It might have happened, you might have went through the process and you did get something out of it, but it wasn't what you intended. And that's exactly what using an immunoassay to measure your hormones is. So one of the things that we've done is we've developed a one-touch, which allowed you to get 2 measurements for your hormones at different time points from a dried blood spot. So you could prick your finger first thing in the morning and get a morning cortisol when you're fasted to see what is my peak cortisol level, and then prick your finger again before bed and then get it right before bed. And now you've actually seen the diurnal variation in where your body is. Perhaps your cortisol level is still really high at night, even though you've had day of food, different things, and it's still high. Well, that's suggesting that your body is overproducing. Maybe in the morning, your cortisol level is low and you might have something like a Cushing's or an Addison type disease. One of the other things that we were able to do in using the one touch with athletes is we were able to notice that lifting weights and resistant training actually lowered cortisol levels while doing cardiovascular work, maintaining 70% VO2 max, typically maintain or raise cortisol levels. So being able to use that level of diagnostics in a simple finger prick where you're able to see the diurnal variation can give an entirely new perspective on where your hormones are at and allow you to fine tune and improve your health. Because remember, you can't manage what you don't measure. And so when you measure it properly, you can manage it properly. Now, I went a little bit overboard with this when I was originally trying to get back in shape several years ago. I started the whole workout grind, getting in shape or trying to because I'd been working too much. And I noticed no matter what I did, I couldn't lose fat. So as somebody that's developing novel diagnostic tests and able to measure hormones from a finger prick, I got bored. And every day at the same time, I measured my hormones Monday through Friday for 3 weeks straight. Part of it, we were just collecting data. And what I found was over that 3-week time, I ended up with where my cortisol was slightly elevated on a Monday. By Friday, they were completely out of range. And then I would see it on the following Monday. It was back down maybe a little higher, but there. By Friday, once again, by the 3rd week I'd measured it, my cortisol levels were coming in at 28, which unless I was in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy, which in this modern era, might be claimed, but we know it's not scientifically possible. I knew something was wrong. And so I had to make changes to the way my schedule worked. And the moment I was able to adjust my schedule, I added a few supplements in. The biggest thing was I started forcing myself to have small meals throughout the day, because if your body thinks it's starving, it goes back into that caveman mentality and it raises cortisol levels up, because it's saying, hey, whenever I do get food, I am going to stuff this into every cell in my body. And so it's trying to spare you because your body thinks it's starving. So I began to feed myself, even if it was the smallest meal. Every couple of hours, I was putting a little bit of food on my stomach so that my body would never be convinced that it was hungry. The next thing I did was, because I was working so many hours, on Wednesdays, I would purposely stop work a little early, get home at about 5, and instead of going back to my home office and keep working, I was like, you know what? I'm going to go to bed early on this night. And I would get to bed at a reasonable hour, and I'd use a low dose of melatonin on them, because melatonin does help reset the circadian rhythm. And then I would do it on Friday night and Saturday night with the melatonin, and those were enough to reboot, so that instead on a Monday, my cortisol might have been 17, and on Friday it was 26, 27 before. After, it might have been 16 on a Monday, but only 22, 23 on a Friday. The moment that happened, over the course of the next 6 weeks, I ended up dropping 2 inches off my waist. So it was literally, the proof was in the pudding, and I was able to see it from my chemistry. Again, that's what happens when you manage what you measure. So when you measure it properly, then you can manage it. The problem is when you're not measuring it properly, then you can't manage it. So in closing, what we really want to be able to take from this is that wherever you're getting your cortisol measured, whatever doctor's doing it, or if you're a provider, make sure the lab is using tandem mass spectrometry. 2, get the cortisone measurement so that you can get a cortisol-cortisone ratio, so that you can get an idea about where the adrenal reserves are. 3, never settle for the immune no-say. Remember, you don't want to wake up with a 2. And this has been Chris Franklin with an Endocrine Minute.